How many of you ever saw the movie The Right Stuff? Right? Okay, great movie, wonderful story. Turns out that not all the stuff was there. There was some stuff missing, arguably some very important stuff, and we're going to be talking about that tonight. How many of you saw the movie Hidden Figures? Yeah, that was, I absolutely loved that movie, and it's a good example of the kind of thing we're going to be talking about tonight, a story that was for so long hidden and unknown. It's a beautiful and amazing story about the incredible women who helped make the early space missions possible through their mathematics and computing skills, even taught IBM a thing or two about how to run mainframes. So a really marvelous story. But that's the story that we're pursuing tonight as we talk about from cowboys to communities and how the future of space exploration and space settlements is going to change, and then how we're maybe moving past the era of cowboys and into the area of building communities that's going to involve a lot different infrastructure, a lot different look and feel in terms of participants and personnel and personalities involved, more inclusive, more diverse, more capable, more creative. We've got some big problems to solve. I think the future of space travel, going back to the moon, hopefully going on to Mars, the establishment of settlements, it's going to make it seem eventually like this is a mundane task. It's no longer the fun cowboy era, but something else. Nevertheless, the engineering and science challenges will continue to be and are still daunting, to say the least. So the more skills and backgrounds and personnel and individuals we can have being part of that effort, the better off we'll be. So let me tell you a little bit about our featured speaker tonight, and we'll jump right into the program and have her come right up. So Jan Millsaps is a veteran filmmaker. She's a pioneering figure in the new media movement, as it's known, the early web innovator, and she's also a versatile and accomplished writer. She's produced films, videos, digital and interactive cinema on subjects ranging from domestic violence to global terrorism, and has written 2 space-themed novels. Screwed Pooch, 2007, tells the story of Soviet space dog Laika, the first female space explorer. Venus on Mars, I like that, 2015, blends the stories of 3 generations of women into one masterful and multi-layered saga examining our ongoing fascination with Mars, which, by the way, is one of the core subjects of research at the SETI Institute, and incorporates augmented moments, clickable links to additional online material. Her most recent film multimedia project, Madam Mars, Women and the Quest for Worlds Beyond, reframes the early years of space exploration within the context of planned human missions to Mars, and argues that this time around, women will not be peripheral, but critical to the success of eventual Martian outposts and settlements. So I can let you read more about that on our website, but she'll tell you more about that. So I'm not going to read the rest of all of that. It would sort of steal the show. Jan is a professor emeritus of cinema at San Francisco State University, where she taught courses in digital cinema, interactive cinema, web cinema, and short format screenwriting. She earned her BA with honors in creative arts at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, her MA in English at Winthrop University, and her PhD in rhetoric and composition at the University of South Carolina. She also holds an academic certificate in cosmology from the University of Central Lancashire in England. So typical of speakers at the SETI talks, sadly uneducated individual. So with that, let me ask Jen to come up and tell you the story about our migration from cowboys to communities. Thank you very much.
So I'm looking out through the audience, and I think I'm seeing people that, like me, were here for the first space age. How many people were here for the first space age? And I'm seeing some people who were not. How many people were not here for the first space age? Okay. We're going to start off with a recap. So whether you were there or not, you're going to get a sense of what it was like from the very beginning up through our last trip to the moon. So here we go. This is a scene from my film, Madam Mars.
Blast off! There he goes! Man in space!
Man is no longer earthbound. Man. 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 Man.
I think it's a great adventure, probably the greatest adventure of mankind, at least in our century.
Landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
It's one small step for man.
Man. Man. Man.
When I saw Neil Armstrong step foot on the moon, I said, wow, that's the potential of humanity, right? And us as a human race.
Hot summer night, July 1969. I'm out playing hide and go seek. Then I hear this voice calling me out of the wilderness.
Clear, how's it going?
I come in, a grainy image of this human walking on the moon,
Roger, the EVA is progressing beautifully.
and I can't believe what I'm seeing.
There seems to be no difficulty in moving around.
All that mattered was that one day I wanted to see my footprint on the moon.
Let me say this, we made a study in NASA while the Apollo program was still alive on how we would send a man to Mars with modern technology.
How about women?
Well, I tell you, Women's Lib will see to it that...
Okay. So before we move on to how the Women's Lib women accomplished all of that Werner von Braun promised, let's talk about the cowboy, the astronaut cowboy first. So from the film clip, I think you got the idea. There were a lot of men involved in the early space age, specifically Caucasian men. There was a reason for that. Some of you probably already know it, but being an astronaut in the beginning was restricted to being those who were also experienced military jet fighter pilots. And women were not allowed to do that. Minorities were not allowed to do that. So our first space age, at least the people who went into space, were white men. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, let's talk about astronaut love. How many people love astronauts? Yeah, and we love this guy. We love John Glenn. We love all the guys that went into space. I was one of those that memorized every name, every mission, you know, up until I think we got somewhere in the mid-Apollo, and it just got too confusing, and I couldn't remember everybody anymore. But it was the thing to really love astronauts, and this was the face of space exploration. That has changed. We still love our astronauts. This is Yvonne. She was in my film. You just saw her. And So-Young, I met her recently. We just did a World Space Week event together. But I can tell you, and if you've ever been to an event, when an astronaut walks in wearing a flight suit, it doesn't matter who else is there or what else they've done. Nobody else matters, right? We love astronauts. Cool. They're great, fun people. I think it is worth talking a little bit about where the idea of the astronaut cowboy came from. When we were first making plans to send humans into space, we had just come out of the Second World War. We were still in a war. We were in the Cold War. And we were in a race. We were in the space race. And we were losing. Actually, up until we landed astronauts on the moon, we were losing the space race big time. So people from the military, people who could do heavy lifting, literally, were a part of what constituted the astronaut cowboy, the astronaut hero, the individual who performed better and was braver and stronger and smarter and everything, and we admired them for that. But I think the other thing that to acknowledge is really that there is the story of the astronaut cowboy. The story came from media. Most of us were not there, so we had to depend on people like Walter Cronkite, who came in our living room every evening to do the CBS News, and he was quite a space fanatic, and he loved astronauts more than any of you love astronauts, I guarantee it. And so he told the story of the space race evening after evening. to take it a step farther, and Bill already mentioned this, but the whole idea of the right stuff. So storytellers took the events of the first space age and ran with them and made stories. So there's the space age, there's the actual literal events that made up the space age, and then there's the story of the space age. And part of what I'm trying to examine in the film that I made is, where did that story come from? Who tells the story? Who decides, what goes into your story and what doesn't? The right stuff was all about the astronaut cowboy. However, there were a lot more people involved in space exploration. I had seen this photo off and on for years and years and years. It looks like a sea of men in white shirts and dark, narrow ties. I bet you there's some pocket protectors in there someplace. And I didn't realize until I saw this ad. If you see the yellow thing at the top, it's a highlighter. It's a German company that makes highlighters called Stabilo. They did an ad campaign recently called Highlighting the Remarkable. And they were trying to show you people who have not been recognized for their achievements in various places. So if you look at this one a little bit closer and you look at where the yellow highlighter goes, you end up seeing a woman right there. And part of what I was trying to do in my film is figure this out. First of all, were there women there? Were they present from the beginning? Well, yes, they were. Were they visible? Well, not so much. So if you know who this is, I'll tell you anyway. It's Katherine Johnson, who's famous for Hidden Figures now. Everybody knows the story of Katherine Johnson. But she was responsible for getting some of the Apollo flights up and down, and so she was invited to mission control at one point. So here's a story that we now know that a couple of years ago we didn't know, the story of Hidden Figures. So we know now about Katherine Johnson, we know about Mary Jackson, we know about Dorothy Vaughan, because somebody wrote a book about it, and then somebody even more visibly made a movie about it. So we are beginning to find stories of people who were involved in the early space age that we didn't know about before. And Katherine Johnson did not work alone. She worked in a community. She was in a community of female, African-American female mathematicians. So she was a standout in the community, but she was a member of the community. So all along while we had the space cowboy, and we were telling that story, there was another whole story going on, which was how these communities were evolving and what happened in these communities and who was a member of these communities. And just to say this, I mean, a boys' club is not the same thing as a community. So a boys' club, like the men in mission control, for instance, or the male engineers, they tend to keep people, they keep to themselves separate. They keep people out. Whereas a community is expansive, it opens up and invites people in. So there's a big difference in the communities that were present in the early space age, and especially the communities of women. We're finding out more. Communities of women actually existed before we went into space. There's a really good book called The Glass Universe about the computers at Harvard University. Maybe some of you know about these. They were women who were trained as mathematicians or even had degrees in astronomy, but they were not allowed to look through telescopes, at least not through big telescopes. They spent their time counting stars based on the photographic plates that men looking through telescopes had made. And they were called computers because they computed the relative brightness of stars. Computers and communities go together. Some of the very early massive room-sized computers like the ENIAC at the University of Pennsylvania, women were the first computer programmers. I don't know if you knew that or not, because it was a really physical thing of plugging. You had to plug it in here or plug it in there to get it to be off or on, yes or no. And it looks a lot like being a telephone operator, right? So it was considered women's work. Computer programming was women's work at first. We go from there to yet another version of computers. Not only were there computers in Katherine Johnson's community back at Langley, there were computers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and it's told in the book called The Rise of the Rocket Girls. I recommend all these books if you want to read more. And these computers eventually got us into space, got us to the moon. and at least got us to Mars with unmanned spacecraft. So we owe a lot to the communities, even though they were fairly anonymous and relatively unknown, at least until recent times. Now, what happens as we look forward to Mars? I think we're done with space cowboys for a while. I think what Mars really needs is communities. And the reason Mars needs communities is that sending humans to Mars is going to be vastly different from sending humans to the moon. When we sent humans to the moon, we were trying to win the race, win the war. It was all about the accomplishment. It was all about getting there, planting the flag, but then coming right back home, you know, and it was only a couple of days away. So you could go and plant a flag, come home inside of a week, right? When we go to Mars, it's going to be a lot different because you can't just run up to Mars and come right back. It's going to take a lot longer, and eventually humans are going to stay on Mars. Right now, a lot of the emphasis is on the hardware, the rockets that are going to get us to Mars, and that's really, really important. But I would like to see more emphasis on what happens after we land on Mars, because then everything changes. It's not about rockets anymore. It's about living there, working there, sustaining yourselves. And we are going to need to build communities. We're going to need to figure out how to manage the resources we need on Mars, how to manage ourselves as human beings in a very hostile new environment. So communities on Mars are going to be vital to the success of humans on Mars. I'm going to show you another clip from the film, and it really addresses, this clip comes toward the end of the film. I hope you get to see the whole film at some point, I really do. But this comes toward the end of the film and kind of summarizes how far we've come since the first space age. And I think the question then lingers, have we come far enough? Here's another clip from Madam Mars.
All systems are in readiness for blastoff. Are you ready?
Activating airlock.
Are we seriously going into space?
Welcome to your spacecraft. All right, so you want to find your stations and have a seat?
3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff.
Just to settle for a second and just feel it. You would hardly know, but we are traveling at 69,500 miles an hour. We're headed right on course for Mars.
We probably should be on Mars by now, but for many reasons which I won't go into, we're not. We're stuck in low Earth orbit. And low Earth orbit is okay, but it's still not space. You can talk. For 30 years, people have talked to go to Mars. No one's really put it into action.
I could have very well been an astronaut that would have gone to Mars in the mid-1980s had we gone ahead with that plan, which was the plan we had at the end of the Apollo era.
2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector good.
That's been a big disappointment for me.
Okay, Houston, as I stand out here in the wonders of the unknown, I realize there's a fundamental truth to our nature. Man must explore.
In the 1970s, nobody was, encouraging little girls to be astronauts. Nobody was encouraging little girls to say, go take aerospace engineering.
I believe that we are smart enough to correct our mistakes. I believe we are intelligent enough to recognize the talent, energy, and dedication which all Americans, including women and minorities, have to offer.
That's how the main man, of course, is equal rights. Equal rights to have a job, to get into graduate programs, to get into schools, to training programs. They aren't frivolous demands at all. We just want what men have had all these years.
Do you feel like there were any advantages to being a woman back then in the early days?
No.
Hey, Hey, don't I know you from somewhere?
Girl scientist.
Oh, yes. Now I remember.
When I first got to JPL, there were almost no women. I think I was the only female engineer.
I didn't have any female role models. You know, there really weren't women in the field to have as role models. Most of the meetings that I went to, or, you know, my early professional scientific meetings, I would be the only woman in a room of 300 men.
The girls they take to Mars are going to have it great, won't they, Doctor?
100 men to every woman.
Oh, there she is.
The JPL Beauty Contest. It's a reminder that we were just decoration.
It was really more of a joke at JPL than anything else. I mean, I was Miss Winniewood. I was used to that culture of women being, you know, honored for being pretty or whatever.
I think we've come a long way, but the last NASA Beauty Contest, I think, was Miss Apollo or something like that in 1973. So that's not that long ago, and we still have a long way to go.
There was one incident where there was a little meeting going on, and we looked around. We were making lots of progress. Things were really going well, and we looked around, and we were all women. And that had never happened to us before, that we were in a meeting where everybody was a woman.
That is lots of progress, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's our turn.
It's our turn.
It's our turn.
It's our turn.
It's our turn now.
It's our turn.
It's our turn.
It's our turn.
It's our turn. Es nuestro tiempo.
It's our turn. It's our turn.
It's definitely our turn.
I would like to see, for me, of course, I'm very biased, to see an all-female team to be the first to go to Mars.
Mars needs women.
Mars needs. It's a gag. It's a prank. It's a fake.
I don't think so, sir.
Women are needed on Mars. I think we can do a lot more than men can do. Sorry, men.
I'm really excited about colonization because that's an opportunity to kind of rewrite the conversation.
It's not about just going to Mars. It's about the evolution of humanity to evolve us to that higher level, which we're capable of doing, which we haven't succeeded yet. We can take our biases with us, but we can also train ourselves.
About 200 days later, the space vehicle approaches Mars.
You are clear for landing. Over. Mass control. This is the spacecraft. We are preparing to land on Mars. Over.
We're right on course. Everything's looking very good. And wait a second here. All right, we've got high winds. Nav, hold it steady here. Could get a little bumpy here. Here we go. We're now deploying our chutes. Chutes are deployed. We're dropping off our heat shielding. We have no more need of that. We've got all 3 chutes fully inflated. Thrusters are slowing our descent. Crew, prepare for touchdown. 5, 4, easy does it. Bring it down nice and easy. 1. Mission control, we've landed on Mars. Repeat, we've landed on Mars.
As we go forward, there are many questions that we bump into that are legitimate questions. They may seem almost like science fiction, but we do need to think, what is the meaning of having humans someplace else? What would their life be like in a place that has low gravity, that has a different atmosphere, that has radiation that is way higher and lethal, in fact, on the Martian surface?
You know, baby steps. You go there first, and then you see what the physiological consequences are and the physiological opportunities of living on another world. The trick is going to be to do it right, and that's hard.
I'd like to ask Brian and Margaret Race to join me on the podium, and let me give you a brief introduction to our panelists. Brian Patrick Green is the Director of Technology Ethics at the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. His responsibilities include representing the center at the Partnership on Artificial Intelligence to benefit people and society, speaking and publishing on AI ethics, as well as various other topics in ethics and technology, and coordinating the center's partnership with the Tech Museum of Innovation in San Jose. Green's background includes doctoral and master's degrees in ethics and social theory from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. His undergraduate degree is in genetics from the University of California, Davis, and he has conducted molecular biology research in both academic and industrial settings. So there's more to this. There's much more, of course, to his bio, but in the interest of time, I'll keep this moving on, but I do encourage you to read the full biography of our speakers on the SETI Talks section of our website. Margaret Race, our very own Margaret Race, and you saw Margaret as well up on the film, is a planetary scientist at the SETI Institute and very much involved in planetary protection. She's concerned with protecting the planets, actually protecting all the planets, but especially Earth and Mars. Her work focuses on the scientific, technical, legal, and societal issues of ensuring that missions to the Red Planet and other solar system bodies do not either inadvertently bring terrestrial microbes along, which would complicate our search for indigenous extraterrestrial life, or return any microbes to Earth. Recently, she's done a research study on the environmental impact reviews and public communication associated with high contaminant biosafety labs, the type that will eventually be used for the quarantine of returned samples from Mars. Her interest in extraterrestrial organisms is linked closely to her long-term ecological research on exotic and invasive species. Again, more bio information on Margaret online, but I think it would be more fun right now to get into the talk. And I understand that you each have a one slide, and I don't know where that is up here, but it's probably on your computer.
Yeah. This is Margaret.
There you go. All right, so Margaret.
Right, am I on? Can you hear me all right? Okay. So what I thought I would do is pick up with the notion of community, because Jan is right. When I was a little girl, I could watch what was on TV about the astronauts. My dad worked for GE, and the helicopter engines that he was involved in were used in the pickup of the astronauts. And astronauts would come when we had Fleet Week in Boston, and I could meet them or just sit there and look at them. I actually did meet. I was, I guess, starstruck as a young kid, and I began looking at what they were doing. I was interested in going to, I personally wasn't interested in going to the moon or Mars, but I thought it was pretty fascinating, these far-out adventures that people took. And what I got involved in was, over time, seeing that my education in science, really interested in marine biology and scuba diving and environmental management, it morphed. How did I, as somebody who worked on the introduction of invasive species, a mud snail in San Francisco Bay that came in by the Transcontinental Railroad, how come I'm working on Mars? Well, I find that astrobiology as a subject, and Mars in particular, thinking about human missions there, has really opened my mindset on interdisciplinary education. So the community is something that's, I don't think anymore about whether it's a girl or a boy. I want competence, and we can find it in everybody. And I want to see it in all sorts of areas. And most people, I think, focus on the rocket scientists, the cowboys, and the getting there because of technology. And it's not until you really look at it, you realize what is all behind it. So astrobiology as a science, which SETI Institute is very much a part of, is really, really interdisciplinary. I work with folks who, next to me, are doing 3D models of asteroids. I work with people that are cosmologists who think about the size and age of the universe. I work with people who are thinking about what will it take to get humans to live on Mars? Oh, you better have suits. You better have artificial life support. Oh, what about food? What about physiology? What about exercise to keep yourself in shape? Oh, by the way, that's a 3-year mission going around to come back to where Earth is. What about psychology? You're going to miss the little glasses of wine and the birthday parties and things like that. There's a whole lot of subjects in addition to the rocket science and the physics and all that go into it. And as we look for life on Mars, too, we're building on all of the research, all of the topics that we all had an opportunity to study in school. And I think that certain places are taking advantage of this notion of interdisciplinarity. How else would somebody who's an artist think about working on Mars and space? How else would we have Oscar-winning movies like The Martian or First Man and things like that? Someone has to know the science and the technology as well as the expertise of the arts. And there are cultural differences too, so that comes into the play. So whether we're talking about missions, most people think about missions to, say, space station, which is just 200 to 400 miles above our head, maybe to the moon, which is about 250,000 miles away. And not so often do they really stop and think about going to Mars in terms of what the solar system's all about. It's 50 million miles. We're talking 3 years. How are you going to survive as humans? And so that doesn't even touch on what our astronomers are doing when they look for extrasolar planets outside our solar system, and then start to think about messaging or detecting signals that are coming back from possible other life. We bump into so many things, and each one of those is a career path. And it's not something that this mudflat biologist ever thought about. I didn't figure I would end up doing this. But in doing it, I bumped into things, too, that are very similar to here on Earth. For instance, I thought about environmental impacts and water pollution. So after my undergrad degree, I worked on looking at the environmental impacts of thermal emissions from fossil and nuclear power plants. I was in an engineering department. And the reason I did that is because I previously thought, oh, water pollution, I'll get into sanitary engineering. And then I found out all the field trips were to places like sewage treatment plants. And I said, no, I got to do better than that. So now this let me get into really thinking far. So I've bumped into planetary protection. What are the rules and regulations that apply when we go off our planet? Well, those are things that we have to make up. We're finding out about life. We're finding out about other locations. And the regulations are set at the international level with the UN, and then translated, using, hopefully, science to say what the rules and regs should be. And so there's many sectors that are involved, as I've talked about, for planning a human mission. And now here along come the commercial folks. May not surprise you, but there aren't any regulations for them. Would they be able to go to the moon and build a tourist hotel and put their waste wherever they wanted? Is that any different than the Apollo missions that left bags of diapers and other things on the moon? Is that what we want to leave behind? So there's all sorts of things that come up. And we have to turn around and fill in the gaps. So everything is under construction. So I like the idea of, the places you'll go, because it's a kind of career thing. But it also involves regulation and politics. And implementation means you have to think about this from prior to the launch, even when you're dreaming about the mission, and coming all the way to the end of the mission. Where are you going to put your waste? Where are you going to put the end of mission spacecraft? What if it crashes in and spews microbes all over the surface of a planet? And those are the kind of risks and decisions that we have to think about in the science and technology field. And it's great when movies like Jan's are able to share that to students. And we're talking really about societal issues and their implications. So when we think about going to the moon, going to Mars, we're no different than the Vikings or Columbus or some of the early explorers. And so there's things to think about culturally, about all the different stakeholders. And believe it or not, the Navajo believe the moon is sacred, and they don't want to see us crash things onto the moon or leave it there. Who gets to call the shots when we have a United Nations Outer Space Treaty? So things are complex. It's a project that keeps on changing. It's under construction, and it takes all of us. The community is not just women and men, but every single discipline. And I really enjoy going into schools and libraries and talking to people about the opportunities that really are out there for everyone. And I thank Jan for her reaching out and grabbing all of us together.
Diversity is key, like your last bullet.
Yes.
All right. So thank you, Margaret, for those comments. And Brian, I think you have a slide as well, so we'll pull that up.
I know I can do this. Okay, let's see. I'm sorry, I can't get my mouse to show up. Do you see a mouse? Okay, let's see.
You look up at the screen, you'll see it or down here.
Okay. Wow, okay. I have no idea. Okay. Can we get some tech support up here? There is really no mouse here. I'm
Trying to call it up now. We can just
yeah. Okay.
You're on here now.
Yeah, right. So, okay, we need to plug it back in.
While we're waiting, I have a question for Jan. How long did it take you from start to finish to do this movie?
4 years.
4.
I wasn't working for 4 years. A lot of it, I was just waiting for people or waiting for money. But yeah, I've spent 4 years working on it.
Wow.
A big chunk of time.
All right, we're back live.
All right.
Brian, go ahead, take it away.
Okay, so I was just going to talk briefly about ethics in space. One of the things that we've been talking about here tonight is the framing of how space is done, right? It used to be that it was framed as these are, men going to the frontier, and they're military men. They have a military background. They're highly trained. All the things that go with that. And that was the frame. But after a while, you say, well, that doesn't have to be the frame. We can remove the frame, and maybe it's not just men. Maybe it's not just military. Maybe it's not just very particular competencies and skill sets that people have. Maybe we can have a much more diverse set of people who are going out there. So disciplinary diversity, I think, is a really important thing to think about in terms of all the different disciplines that there are, right? One of the things that both Jan and Margaret were just talking about was how important the arts are for capturing our imagination and for getting us interested in these stories, and how do we tell a story, and how do we make meaning out of these scientific and technological experiences that we're undergoing. Science and technology always have a context that they're in. It's not just this is straight science or this is straight technology, or you don't just have an Apollo mission that's there with no context around it, right? There was this Cold War going on. There was a space race, and we were talking about a competition between nations and all these other contextual issues that are going on there. And so when you think about this context, it helps you think about things like, well, who gets to choose the missions? Why do we choose that mission? Why don't we choose another mission? How do we communicate and educate about these things? For a while, when the Soviet Union was winning the space race, all of a sudden, the United States said, wow, I guess we don't know enough about science and technology. So we had a huge push in science and technology education. And then, of course, there's always the what-if scenarios that you can think about. So, for example, if there's an asteroid approaching, then there's a story that you can write around that, right? There's movies that have been done. I know that Margaret has been on some scenarios and simulating what would happen in kind of an international context. One-way mission, the idea of a one-way mission for a while seemed really alien, I think, because people went to the moon and they came back, but the idea of just going to Mars and staying there is a very different type of mission. Terraforming Mars, are we supposed to have powers like that? Because people will say, wow, wait a minute, we're kind of messing up our own planet. Should we really go and experiment on another entire planet? And then, discovery of life or intelligent life or directing evolution. Those are all big questions that can't just happen in a purely scientific or technological context. There's a really big context around them. All right, so is there ethics in space? Absolutely, there completely is. Ethics is about questions of ought or should. You already have the can part of it. You can do it. Then the question is, should you? And so when we look at Mars and think about men and women, of course, going to Mars, then how are we going to do that? What should we do? What are the exact ways that we should be constructing these things, and how should we be thinking about it?
Well, it brings to mind that really when you start talking about endeavors like going to Mars or even going back to the moon, where likely as both a test bed but also as an outpost for doing things like space resource mining and things to get water and other things that will be needed even to go on to Mars, et cetera. I mean, these are endeavors that really do engage a community. So they require the ethical considerations, the societal considerations, the diversity considerations, technology and engineering considerations. And to your point, whoever contemplated a long time ago the notion of one-way trips to Mars, but they're very likely to be those in at least the lifetime of some of the folks out in this audience. So I did want to get to one very sort of back down to earth practical question for Jan. Since you talked about the film and hoping everybody can see it, where can people see it? Is there a way for people to see the whole film?
There will be. It is actually not in distribution yet, so this is kind of a sneak preview. I have a distribution, a newsletter and a newsletter list, so if you just give me your contact information before you leave tonight, I will make sure you find out. And I do a quarterly newsletter about all things Mars-related, STEM-related, women in space, women in Mars. So if you give me your contact information, I'll also give you the newsletter.
And when you think about women in space and the broader topic of diversity in space, can you connect for us the relationship to some of the considerations like planetary protection and ethics and societal considerations and how those play in? I mean, maybe there's a different and perhaps even more wise perspective offered by getting more women in space, but maybe you can comment on this.
Well, I mean, I think it's hopeful that not only are we seeing more women in more communities, we're seeing women in leadership positions. There's a new female head of Johnson Space Center. The head of the National Air and Space Museum is a woman. So I think women not only are ready to go, they're ready to lead. And I think they are going to bring a distinct set of values to ethical decisions, like things like terraforming, things like how do we live together on Mars, how do we say goodbye to everybody on Earth if we're never going to see them again. And I just think the more diverse the community is and the more diverse especially the leadership is, the better off we're all going to be.
And where have you seen great steps or great leaps forward in either in education or in business and technology? I mean, there's a lot of progress to be made and a lot of problems to be solved, but are there any examples you can cite where you think or have observed that this is starting to move the ball in the right direction?
I think the whole idea of individual access to knowledge, to experiences, and I think some of this comes through media, some of this comes through innovative educational practices, but I think having people not have to go through a formal educational system to get the information, to be able to get it on their cell phones, I think that is a revolutionary change right there.
Transformative. Yeah. Yeah. Brian, from your point of view, do you see good examples of ethical considerations, societal considerations being taken into consideration for conversations around space exploration, the habitation of Mars, going back to the moon, et cetera?
I think there are a lot of good opportunities for having these discussions now. I think it's really important that the space exploration has really gotten back into the kind of the mainstream mentality. For a while, it was just the province of science fiction movies, but now it's come out into kind of the real world space, and I think that there's definitely ethical aspects to what stories are told. So I think it's really important that we're telling the stories. That's a fairness issue. That's a justice issue. If you're only telling one side of a story, it's not fair. So I think that there's been a lot of opportunities and good things have happened in terms of both raising awareness and in telling the story more fairly.
Okay, can I ask Brian a question?
I think that's a lot.
I know you work in artificial intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
the ethics of artificial intelligence. Is that genderless?
the AI?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you talk to Siri, Siri is not genderless. I mean, this is something that people have talked about a lot, which is why is it that the personal assistant has a female voice, right? I mean, you can go in there and set it to a male voice if you want to, but there's definitely a gendered or sexist dynamic going on in assuming what the voice should sound like and what type of operation and interaction you should be having with it. Now, that's not necessary, right? That's something that's comes from our culture, and it's something that we can decide to change if we want to.
But as we design AI systems, do you think we're still designing them with a particular gender in mind?
I'm not sure. I think it depends. One of the things about AI is that it's such a very broad field. It applies to all forms of human intelligence, you know, anything that we have in ourselves and beyond, right? Animal intelligence also to a certain extent. As that progresses forward, there are different aspects of intelligence that it's going to home in on that we're going to say, oh, that's more male. Or if, you know, if it's a military robot, that there might be a gendered aspect to, oh, that should be a more male type of robot. Or if it's some other, you know, something more stereotypically female, then they might think of it in a more female fashion. But I think that's a really important dynamic to be aware of, and I think a lot of people aren't aware of it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. That you know, we will undoubtedly impose stereotypes that we still hold today that we shouldn't in robotic infrastructure. I think to your point, you start looking at the implementation of robots to do tasks, and the ones that are sort of doing the physical task will probably be more inclined to be male in their sort of design features, voices, et cetera, and the ones who are, like you see at the airports, providing hostess-like services, let me tell you how to navigate your way through the airport, have a female voice, a female face, et cetera. So I think there's definitely something to be careful of there and be aware of. I was just at a robotics and autonomy conference that NASA was sponsoring at Carnegie Mellon University last week, and we got to see a company called Bossa Nova, and you'll probably come across this company if you ever shop at Target or Walmart or places like that. They're deploying robots there to help with making sure shelves are stocked, basically, and using AI, very sophisticated machines with 17 cameras, LiDAR, 2 million lines of code, 3D sensors, you know, motors, self-learning capability to navigate their way around stores. They don't look like anything in particular. They're sort of a squat box with a long arm. They have no personality, no human features whatsoever. So, you know, maybe there's going to be more of that as well. But Margaret, I think you wanted to chime in here.
I wanted to say something about astrobiology and this whole bit about thinking about Mars or the moon or any place in space. One thing that I find educationally is that it's a way to get people outside of our own constraints here on Earth. I could talk about climate change or the articles that I saw in journals today about the loss of insects down in tropical rainforest and then the impact on the food pyramid. These are very real things, and yet they're referred to as fake news, or it's going to happen later, or I just can't deal with it. So by putting students in this notion that they are part of either planning or being on a mission, I can get them to dig down and think about their education or their interests. And I don't give them answers. I ask questions. So I can ask them, okay, this is a photograph of Mars. How are you going to feed the crew for the next 2 years? And one little kid, I do this as a volunteer. It's another thing, volunteers going into classrooms or libraries and ask them things like, how would you do this? What would you do for water resources? And so little kids can sit there and say, well, let's see, I drink so many of these a day, and I'll have a crew of 4 or 6. They're doing math. Oh, by the way, the gravity's different. Oh, I need to put some weights on my shoes. And they're deciding, or if you could get to the middle school or high school and ask them, okay, the mission to Mars might be 6 to 9 months. Do you have a co-ed crew? What happens 9 months? Well, last I checked, that was the length of the average pregnancy. What happens? So these movies that are out there about being born on Mars, you can get the students to take it on and then back it up to what they've got for governance or ethics or engineering or approaches to problems that we have on Earth. So I come in with a way that I'm educating. I'm not giving them answers. I'm not imposing gender, I hope. I'm setting it up as a hypothesis test. And then they can also tap into their own interests.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one of the wonderful things I would say about space science and exploration is it is a great platform for education broadly, not just in the sciences, but also in all these other areas. Issues like, for example, health and human reproduction and ethics and diversity and so on. So I think that one of the nice things about using the platform of space exploration and discovery as a platform for education on a lot of fronts. It provides context, but it's something interesting and cool and engaging, and it's a way also to connect dots between things we wouldn't normally perceive to be connected. So I think that gives us a wonderful chance. Also, I would say that in terms of space exploration, ultimately missions to places back to the moon and to places like Mars and beyond, unmanned or unpersoned missions to Enceladus and Europa to look for life. These are interesting and engaging science and engineering projects in their own right, but they give us also a different perspective when we look back on Earth and help us understand a little bit more about the fragility of ecosystems here and the importance of subjects like climate change and a better awareness of what's going on here and the problems we have to face in the very near future. We're already at the top of the hour, and I did want to give an opportunity for people in the audience, if you had some questions you'd like to ask. We do have a microphone up here. You're welcome to come up and ask a question to any of the panelists, so we'll go right into it.
Hi, I'm super shy, you can tell. I have a question, since it's about community, and this is actually for all of you, because colonizing Mars would be unlike colonizing the New World or anywhere else, because, okay, you're like a year and a half from home, but you've got not quite Apollo-level instant communication where it's a few seconds time delay. It's a few minutes time delay. Might be a crucial few minutes if there's an emergency. So how do you have all the support staff on Earth that are there to make sure your nascent colony on Mars doesn't die or terrible things happen or, you know, have great difficulties. So how do you make a single community out of the people on Mars and the people on Earth when they're a year and a half away physically, 20 minutes maybe away conversationally, and that kind of, and then the physiological changes for the people who are on Mars versus the people on Earth who are not experiencing that environment psychologically, physically, you know, in a visceral, embodied sort of way. It's unprecedented.
It is, in some ways, yes, it is. In others, I bet all of us are the children of migrants at some point. So when my great-grandmother left Lithuania to come here, she never saw her family again. It was a one-way mission. Of course, she didn't need artificial life support to keep her alive.
There wasn't really, like, you know, phone calls either, right?
There were
like,
none.
You know?
She never had any communication again. And it wasn't until I went to a conference in Poland and went up to visit the birth town, and I met my relatives. I was the first one back for over 120 years. So you don't think about it. So this is the way when I talk to students in a classroom, it makes them realize we've done it here. And
sure,
then
and that's my family too, my grandparents, three of them.
And so the same thing, the difference is that we can trust on an environment and a planet that works a certain way, and I can make all of you live in artificial life support. Go live in a submarine. We know how to do it. Go live the rest of your life in a submarine. And we don't even have the time differences in talking. So there's ways that you can make students understand governance and ethics and technology here by playing with something that seems so far out.
I think we're somewhat already used to asynchronous communication with email, and you know, we don't have to talk live. In fact, most of our communication these days is not face-to-face live.
My kids haven't discovered that cell phones, you can actually talk on them.
Yes.
There's an app for that.
So in a way, I think we're conditioned already to handle that.
Sure, that's a good point. Yeah.
Brian, did you have anything to add to that?
Anything ethical about this?
I think some of the ethical aspect of it is that there will certainly be divergence, I think, between the two communities. You can't, I don't know if you can maintain one solid community between Mars and Earth. There's definitely going to be divergence. And when divergence happens, then ethical tensions may arise. You know, people on Mars are going to obviously feel more strongly about the environment that they're in, or they're going to know different things about what they're experiencing there than people back on Earth are going to be experiencing. So there could definitely be tensions that appear, I think.
Thank you.
It's a great question. So it's a good thought experiment. Just imagine that you're the mission planner, and you're sending the first 6 people to Mars who may have something to do with even setting up infrastructure for subsequent missions. what skill sets would you want on that mission? What diversity would you want on that mission? What capabilities and talents would you want on that mission? Think about that. And I bet if we passed around a paper and asked you, give those 6 answers, we'd probably get 100 different answers. It'd be a lot of fun to do. Anyway.
So I'm concerned about whether human beings can live long term. And when we're talking about colonizing Mars, it's not like a year in the International Space Station, but decades of a human lifespan in Martian gravity. We know that 0G causes bad effects, and somewhere between 0 and 1, there must be some minimum G that we can live at. But I don't know if there's any confidence it's near the 35% that is Mars.
Well, if you don't want to come back to Earth, there's no problem.
Well, so
that's the problem, is readapting. I mean,
you don't. Doesn't the immune system shut down in 0G? I mean, would that be? I mean, if there's still issues at 35%, I don't. I mean, to me it. And also, if you have a colony, you probably would want to have it, to reproduce. I mean, at some point. I mean, I was just wondering if there's any plans, like, you could put up a 35% centrifuge, attach it to the International Space Station to explore human physiology at Martian gravity.
Well, I think, certainly using the International Space Station isn't necessarily a good experiment for that, since that's 0G. The moon,
well, you attach it.
You can tack onto it. The moon gives us at least 1/6 G. Yeah. I don't know that the human biome shuts down at 0G, but it certainly is impacted and changes. There are studies going on now as to what is the impact on the human biome of extended time in space at 0G or low G situations. So, but I mean, I think the point you're making is that there are just almost an infinite number of considerations to take into account when you're starting to plan something like we're going to start, putting humans on another planet, and they're going to be there in some cases. They are going to be there for decades or forever. They're going to start, and certainly this will happen ultimately, to be generations, who are born and die on new planets. And I think you raised the point that there's just a massive amount of considerations that go into that.
I mean, I don't think they're insurmountable. I just curious if anybody's making any plans to
step by step.
Yeah.
The insurmountable part, the biologist is going to bring up, which is there's sort of evolutionary time. That's the nice thing about astrobiology too. It makes you think about cosmic timescales, geological timescales. And when we talk about adapting to another place, adaptation, we still look like my great-grandmother did when she came here. And we can trace back to Columbus and further, and they still look like people. Okay, I'm a vertebrate, so I'm related to a whale. They're on our tree of life. But it's been millions of years since we've been like that. So I don't think it's so easy, and I'm a little bit concerned about the ethics of this, that we're talking about going to Mars, settling on Mars, and ain't going to happen, not in our lifetime. And I don't know what kind of biological shift you're going to need to do that.
Well, I think one of the huge ethical questions is reproduction on Mars. I mean, is it even something we should consider? But if you're going to live there and survive there and sustain yourself over generations, I mean, it's something that needs to be addressed. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that if assuming that you want to have a sustainable colony on Mars, you need to have reproduction. So I guess it's going to happen. I mean, this is you're right to be concerned, right? With all the questions that you're raising. There's a huge amount of unknown. There's a lot that we don't know, but the whole point of science is that you learn things you don't know. So you get into a situation. You're right. I know that you're not opposed. What I'm saying is that if the experiment is done, then presumably the people are there of their own free will and they know the dangers they're getting into, so they have informed consent. Does the child being conceived have informed consent? They have proxy informed consent through their parents. So does that count? I mean, these ethical questions are important ones to raise.
I think the only question that really matters is if you have a Martian birth certificate, will you be able to run for president?
On Mars, yes.
Anyway, thank you very much for that question. We have time for a couple more.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. So assuming that we we don't stagnate here and we actually go out and explore it, do we have a perhaps ethical, but also just like as a species, do we have a responsibility to go out and explore? And assuming that the longer it takes for us to get out of this kind of, paddling in the shallows phase that we're currently in, do we have a responsibility to go as quickly as possible? And are there compromises there in terms of protection, in terms of, societal implications? So.
That's a Brian question.
I think we do. I think that there's a scientific or knowledge imperative to it. I think there's also an imperative of our own survival, which is that we know that even if you're looking in the very, very long-term future, we know that there's not a long-term, after a while we're going to have to move. Now that's long-term, but we know short-term also there are a lot of existential risks and other types of risks that we're facing here on Earth. It would probably be smart to have another, I think Elon Musk has called it a backup Earth, but it's I don't know if I really like that phrase. Yeah. I think it's better to think of it as we're human and we learn new things. One of the things that we could do is that we can actually fulfill this function in the universe. Nothing else that we know of can actually do that. So maybe that gives us an obligation to do it.
I'm going to jump in here because I have a very strong opinion on that subject. Surprisingly, given that I'm running an institute called the SETI Institute that's all about life elsewhere, one thing that I think it's very important to note, that in the short term, in terms of thinking about this in the context of anything that has to do with rescuing ourselves from the mess we're making here, there is no plan B that is viable. Mars is not a plan B. Mars is not a nice place to live. The challenges are going to be extreme, and it's not going to be a place that is ever, again, going to look like Earth. It doesn't have a magnetic field, can't hold an atmosphere, can't block cosmic radiation and other, deadly things that come to it. So don't use that as a reason to say, well, we can keep just screwing things up here. The nearest planet, the nearest star system to Earth is Alpha Centauri. It's 4.2 billion light years away. Maybe there are planets there. There likely are. The Kepler mission has told us that there probably are. There might be a habitable zone planet there that could be, viable. The fastest spacecraft we've ever built is the New Horizons spacecraft that shot past Pluto at 39,000 miles an hour and will rendezvous with the Kuiper Belt object actually on New Year's Eve this year, so keep that in mind. If we took that spacecraft to Alpha Centauri, it would take us 17,000 years to get there. So, there isn't another Earth-like planet in this solar system. So it may be, to some degree, our imperative, and it may be built into our DNA to go and explore and to travel and go wherever technology of the day can take us. But please don't think of that as any kind of a short-term rescue mission for this planet.
Well, you also ask if we need to be, I don't think we need to be in a hurry. I would rather do it right than do it quickly. And I used to be in the camp that, forget the moon, we've been there, done that, let's go to Mars. I've rethought all of that, and I now really think we need to use the moon as a proving ground and test a lot of our systems, a lot of what we need to implement on Mars while we are still within a few days' reach. So I don't think we need to be in a big hurry to go to Mars.
Just to add on with the environmental end, like the trade-off, do we go quick and spread our bugs, or do we hold off and keep it as a preserve?
Well, for right now, planetary protection focuses more on protecting the science. Yes. And the time frames that we're talking about here are amazing. Right now, we just finished 10 years of looking at how would you go from qualitative requirements that we say, keep Earth safe and all of that, and turn that into regulations that go into an engineering design for suits and vents and things like that. It's going to take us a very long time to do it. And so these questions of time also mean it's not just like we're taking that money and putting it out there. What are we not spending it on here as well? So that's why I love this in talking to students, because you could say, you be the proponent for going there. And then I'd say, okay, who is going to be the committee to decide which 10 people go to Mars? So you talk about saving the Earth. Yeah, okay, who's going to decide who's on that ship?